On the cold morning of early 1942, as Japan's newly forged empire stretched from the mountains of Burma to the blue edges of the Central Pacific, the atmosphere inside Tokyo's military ministries was one of deep, unhurried confidence. The hallways of the Imperial Navy and Army headquarters, usually filled with the brisk pace of officers and clerks, now carried a quieter rhythm, the kind of calm that follows an unexpected string of victories. Maps hung along the walls, large, meticulously drawn sheets marked with inked arrows that curved outward like the spokes of a rising sun. Red pins marked the rapid fall of British positions in Malaya. Blue pins indicated collapsing American defenses in the Philippines. Green pins tracked the movement of Japanese divisions sweeping through the Dutch East Indies. Each pin seemed to others to represent inevitability, a quiet assurance that the war, only months old, was already bending in Japan's favor. Inside one of the central planning rooms, a long table was covered with situation reports that continued to arrive from every corner of the newly conquered territories. The Philippines were nearly subdued after the fall of Manila. Hong Kong had surrendered on Christmas Day. The British battleships Repulse and Prince of Wales lay on the ocean floor. In Tokyo, these developments were not merely news, they were confirmation of beliefs long held by the Imperial General Staff, that Western forces were unprepared, inflexible, and too slow to respond to Japan's rapid method of warfare. As officers read through the papers, their expressions carried the faint satisfaction of men who saw their predictions coming true. When the conversation turned to the United States, the tone grew even more dismissive. Officers pointed to the destruction at Pearl Harbor, where battleships had been sunk or broken open like cracked shells. They spoke of America's distance from the war, its famed isolationism, its perceived inability to rouse itself quickly. Some planners believed that the United States, shocked by Pearl Harbor and the sudden collapse of its Pacific defenses, would choose negotiation over retaliation. Others suggested that even if America wanted to fight, it lacked the spirit for a long conflict. A nation accustomed to comfort, one planner reportedly remarked, does not rebuild its navy under fire. These statements flowed easily, as if everyone around the table had silently agreed long before any evidence was needed. At the center of these discussions were thick binders of intelligence summaries. Many of them confirmed Japanese assumptions. American ship losses seemed devastating, and surviving vessels were scattered. Airfields in the Western Pacific had fallen or been abandoned. Army garrisons were surrendering or retreating. Even the Australian forces, though determined, could do little without steady American support, and that support seemed unlikely to materialize soon. Every new report guided Japan's military thinkers toward the same conclusion. The United States was effectively neutralized for the foreseeable future. Yet among these confident voices, the quieter doubts of more experienced officers went mostly unheard. Men like Admiral Yamamoto, who had studied in the United States and understood its vast industrial capacity, watched this growing optimism with a mixture of concern and resignation. Yamamoto had already warned that the Americans, once angered, would wage war with a level of production and endurance few in Japan could imagine. But these warnings felt abstract to planners intoxicated by recent triumphs. For them, the war was already taking shape as a simple equation. Japan advanced, and the Allies retreated. Still, even within the walls of confidence, the maps on the table revealed something planners chose not to dwell on. The American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, Hornet, and a handful of others, remained unaccounted for. They had been at sea during the attack on Pearl Harbor and survived untouched. Their exact positions were unclear, sometimes hinted at by faint radio intercepts or unusual sightings from outposts scattered across the Pacific. These hints suggested that the Americans were not as incapacitated as Tokyo believed. But the planners dismissed these details as minor irritations, anomalies in an otherwise smooth horizon of Japanese success. It was in this mental environment, shaped by victory, warmed by confidence, softened by assumption, that Japan made its strategic decisions for the months ahead. The belief that America was finished was not shouted nor argued. It settled gently, like dust, until it covered nearly every conversation. No one imagined that far across the ocean, in factories lit by midnight lamps and in naval yards humming with sudden purpose, the United States was awakening. Quietly, steadily, and with a resolve unlike anything Japan had yet faced. In the weeks that followed, the sense of invulnerability inside Tokyo deepened. Each morning, clerks carried stacks of situation reports into the strategy rooms, where senior officers reviewed them with a calmness that bordered on complacency. The fall of Singapore appeared imminent. Japanese troops had pushed deep into Burma and the East Indies. Air supremacy seemed assured wherever Japanese forces advanced. It felt, to many inside the Imperial General Staff, as if the war were unfolding along a pre-written script, one in which Japan only needed to continue moving forward and the Allies would continue falling back. Even the growing resistance on Bataan and Corregidor was interpreted as a last, futile gesture rather than the beginning of a prolonged struggle. During informal evening gatherings, planners spoke more freely about what the future might hold. Some discussed Japan's next strategic horizon, whether it would be Australia, the Indian Ocean, or a tightening encirclement of what remained of American influence in the Pacific. The idea that the war might stretch on for years rarely entered their conversations. Instead, they spoke of consolidating control, building defensive perimeters, and shaping a new regional order in Asia. Newspapers echoed this confidence, printing stories of unstoppable soldiers and heroic naval battles. The public absorbed the message, and in many corners of Japanese society, there was a quiet assumption that the worst of the conflict had already been overcome. Yet inside the ministries, a few officers continued to raise concerns. They pointed to the carriers Enterprise and Lexington, whose activities remained elusive. They referenced intercepted signals that suggested a growing pattern of American reconnaissance flights. They noted the sharp increase in American industrial mobilization, a subject that only Yamamoto and a handful of naval officers took seriously. But each of these warnings met the same response, that the United States, still reeling from Pearl Harbor, could not strike back meaningfully for many months, perhaps even a year. And by then, Japan's defensive perimeter would be complete. Such confidence created a certain blindness. When Allied submarines began to score occasional successes against Japanese transports, the incidents were viewed as isolated. When American B-17s appeared unexpectedly over some occupied territories, planners judged these occurrences as symbolic rather than strategic. Nothing, in their view, challenged the narrative that Japan had already secured a decisive upper hand. A sense of inevitability had taken root, forming the invisible foundation of Japanese strategic thought. This mood could be felt most clearly during the briefings held in the spacious naval planning room, illuminated by the pale winter light filtering through narrow windows. Officers sat on both sides of an enormous table, its polished surface reflecting the lines of charts that stretched across it. Here, discussions moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Casual remarks turned into working assumptions. Small victories were magnified, while small dangers were minimized. The planners spoke of advancing into the Indian Ocean, of choking Allied supply lines, of severing Australia from American support. They imagined operations unfolding without serious interruption, relying on the idea that Japan's early momentum would dictate the course of the entire war. But momentum, as Yamamoto often reminded his closest advisors, was the most fragile element of warfare. He had lived in America, studied its language, observed its industries, and understood that beneath its surface calm, the country possessed a capacity for rapid and overwhelming mobilization. Yamamoto's warnings, though respected, were rarely heeded. They seemed too cautious, too pessimistic, too far removed from the glow of recent triumphs. And in a political environment shaped by nationalism and the triumph of December operations, caution felt almost disloyal. Still, pieces of troubling information continued to appear. Reports from forward outposts noted sightings of American aircraft in unexpected areas. Merchant captains claimed to have heard radio signals that did not match known Japanese or Allied patterns. A few intelligence analysts argued that the Americans might be preparing a limited strike for symbolic effect, an attempt to restore morale. But even this modest possibility gained little traction. Japan's planners, lulled by victory, believed such a strike would be impossible without a functioning carrier fleet, and in their minds, the American carriers were scattered, damaged, and likely incapable of sustained operations. They did not imagine that somewhere beyond the reach of their reconnaissance patrols, a task force was already moving across the vast Pacific. They did not guess that an unfamiliar shape, a medium bomber rather than a carrier fighter, had been chosen for a mission unprecedented in the history of naval warfare. They did not foresee that this mission, conceived not for destruction but for psychological impact, would reach the very capital of the empire. In those final quiet days before April, Tokyo's strategic planners continued shaping their next steps with the serene confidence of men who believed they understood the shape of the world. They were certain of their victories, certain of American weakness, and certain that the war was still theirs to define. They had no way of knowing that a small group of American airmen, training on a distant carrier deck, were preparing to remind them that war seldom follows the plans drawn in quiet rooms. As winter turned slowly into early spring, the quiet certainty inside Tokyo's military headquarters remained largely untouched, even as subtle signals from across the Pacific hinted that something in the American rhythm was changing. Intelligence officers continued to collect scattered reports from merchant ships, coast watchers, and patrol aircraft. Some of these reports referenced unusual flight paths traced by long-range American planes. Others described radio transmissions whose patterns did not match those recorded in the hectic weeks after Pearl Harbor. Most of these findings were small, ambiguous details, each one too faint to stand alone, yet together suggesting a level of American activity that did not entirely fit the narrative of a defeated enemy. Still, few in Tokyo were inclined to interpret these fragments as meaningful. Victory had a way of smoothing over inconsistencies. Throughout March, the Imperial Navy's staff continued to prepare operations for the coming months. Their focus was fixed on the southern front, New Guinea, the Solomons, and the long arc stretching toward Australia. The Japanese High Command believed that the next decisive step would be the isolation of Australia, cutting it off from American reinforcement. By denying the Allies a staging ground in the South Pacific, Japan hoped to secure a defensive perimeter that could not easily be breached. Each map, each operational outline, each proposed timetable reflected this assumption. Even the prospect of American carrier activity was woven into the same confident narrative. The enemy might still be afloat, but they could not strike in force. Within the quiet rooms of the intelligence division, however, a handful of analysts sensed that the American situation might be shifting in ways that Tokyo's planners had not anticipated. Reports indicated that American carriers had been spotted at distances that implied unusual operational patterns. Reconnaissance planes from Japanese bases occasionally encountered American scouting missions in unexpected regions, far beyond the expected reach of a weakened U.S. Navy. One officer noted that the American carriers seemed to be avoiding predictable routes, sometimes appearing farther north, sometimes pushing deep into the Central Pacific, in areas that Japanese naval air groups seldom patrolled. But each report was treated as a curiosity rather than a warning. The assumption that America lacked the capacity for coordinated offensive action shaped the interpretation of every piece of intelligence that passed through the system. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, the United States was accelerating its internal transformation. Aircraft factories in California and Kansas expanded their output each week. Naval yards repaired carriers at unprecedented speed. New pilots trained in relentless cycles, learning to take off from carrier decks in harsh weather, fly low over churning seas, and identify enemy silhouettes with growing confidence. Japanese planners had assumed that the United States would require years to mobilize. They did not imagine that America's industrial and organizational machinery, once set in motion, could surge forward with the momentum of a rising tide. And because these developments occurred far beyond the reach of Japanese reconnaissance, they remained unseen, and therefore unaccounted for. The first concrete hints of the American shift came from faint radio intercepts recorded by Japan's signals intelligence units. These signals were unusual in structure, short, purposeful, and encrypted differently from earlier American transmissions. A number of specialists believed they reflected a fleet assembling for an operation rather than scattered vessels communicating in isolation. But interpreting intent from radio noise was as much art as science, and without corroborating evidence, the significance of the intercepts remained opaque. Senior staff officers, preoccupied with immediate operations in Southeast Asia, saw no urgency in the matter. The Americans, they reasoned, simply lacked the ability to launch a major strike. Anything beyond that was speculation. Then came the reports from fishing trawlers and picket boats operating far off Japan's eastern coastline. A few vessels claimed to have sighted silhouettes on distant horizons, large, unfamiliar ships moving purposefully but keeping their distance. Some fishermen reported aircraft overhead, though the descriptions were vague. One vessel spoke of hearing engines that did not match the sound of Japanese reconnaissance planes, but the sea distorts sound, and such impressions were difficult to verify. Patrol boats dispatched to investigate found nothing. Weather patterns changed rapidly in those waters, and visibility could shift from clear to obscure in minutes. The Imperial Navy reviewed these sightings cautiously, but since none were confirmed, the matter was quietly set aside. This pattern, small signals, slight anomalies, faint hints of movement, continued throughout early April. They formed a thin, scattered trail leading across the Pacific, but without a framework to interpret them, the pieces never came together. In the absence of a coherent picture, the intelligence system defaulted to the prevailing belief that America could not act decisively. Confidence, once rooted, can become its own form of blindness. And in Tokyo, that confidence still guided every major assumption. All the while, the American task force pressed steadily westward across the Pacific, maintaining strict radio silence. The crews aboard the carrier Hornet continued their preparations, practicing procedures in the confined, unpredictable environment of a warship at sea. Engines were tested repeatedly, fuel loads were recalculated. Pilots rehearsed emergency procedures in cramped ready rooms while ocean spray washed across the deck outside. The operation remained invisible to Japanese eyes, not because it was hidden behind sophisticated deception, but because no one expected something so bold to be attempted. Japan's planners did not yet understand that their early victories had not ended American resolve. They had awakened it. Far across the Pacific, beyond the normal range of Japanese reconnaissance flights and outside the patterns that Tokyo's planners routinely studied, the American task force pressed forward through rough spring seas. Aboard the carrier Hornet, the unusual sight of 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers dominated the deck. Their high wings, broad frames, and long fuselages made the deck appear impossibly narrow, a sharp contrast to the sleek silhouettes of carrier-based fighters usually stationed there. Sailors paused during their duties to look at the planes, knowing that what they saw represented something unprecedented in naval aviation. Never before had medium land bombers been launched from an aircraft carrier, and no one could say with certainty how the mission would unfold once the fleet reached its launch point. The men assigned to the operation moved with a steady, methodical determination. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, whose name the mission would later carry, was constantly in motion, inspecting planes, reviewing navigation charts, and speaking quietly with crew members. The pilots and bombardiers trained relentlessly, practicing short takeoff techniques on the deck of the Hornet as the carrier pitched and rolled. Each man understood that the margin for error was far narrower than in any training scenario they had known. If a bomber failed to lift off in time, it would plunge into the cold Pacific waters. If an engine faltered during takeoff, there would be no room to abort. The deck offered only one direction and one chance. At night, the pilots gathered in dimly lit ready rooms, hunched over maps spread across metal tables. They examined Japanese coastline contours, studying possible approach routes toward Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe. They discussed wind conditions that might carry smoke and debris across the cities. They prepared for the uncertainty of escaping toward China afterward, knowing that they would likely run out of fuel long before reaching friendly airfields. Some whispered quietly about the dangers of capture. Others wondered whether the raid would have any tangible effect on the war. But even in these private conversations, no one questioned the purpose of the mission. Every man knew it was intended not to destroy Japan's industrial infrastructure, but to strike at something far more delicate: the confidence that Japan had built around itself like armor. Meanwhile, the Enterprise, sailing in formation ahead of the Hornet, provided the fighter screen needed to protect the slow-moving bombers. Its F-4F Wildcats patrolled the skies, watching for Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. Yet none were spotted. The vast expanse of ocean between Midway and Japan, coupled with shifting weather patterns, concealed the American movements more effectively than anyone had predicted. The fleet's approach remained undetected, not because of sophisticated deception, but because Tokyo simply did not expect an enemy force to be present in those waters at all. Assumptions made months earlier about American weakness, about the narrow scope of U.S. naval capability, about the timeline of recovery after Pearl Harbor, continued to guide Japanese expectations, leaving them blind to the possibility of a strike. On the morning of April 18th, as a gray sky hung low over the fleet, the American task force encountered a Japanese picket boat. The small vessel, part of a thin defensive line Japan maintained far from its coast, spotted the carriers and attempted to send a warning message. The Americans reacted immediately. Naval guns opened fire, eventually sinking the boat, but uncertainty lingered. Had the warning been fully transmitted before the boat was destroyed? Could the Japanese mobilize air or naval forces quickly enough to disrupt the mission? The original launch point, still many miles away, suddenly appeared too distant to risk. After brief consultation, Doolittle and the naval commanders agreed to launch the bombers immediately, despite the treacherous distance now required to reach China afterward. The order went out. Engines roared to life. The deck crews worked efficiently, guiding the first bomber into position at the very edge of the carrier's bow. The ship turned into the wind, gathering speed. Waves crashed against the hull, spraying mist across the deck. Doolittle climbed into his aircraft, adjusted his gear, and gave a final nod to the ground crew. With engines trembling at full power, his bomber surged forward, wheels rattling as it accelerated across the short deck. For a moment, the aircraft seemed to hang at the edge of falling, nose dipping slightly as it cleared the deck. Then the wind caught its wings, and the bomber rose, lifting gently into the overcast sky. One by one, the rest followed. The scene unfolded with a quiet tension, each takeoff carrying the weight of the mission's hopes. Sailors watched silently, their eyes fixed on the retreating forms of the bombers as they disappeared into the clouds. The fleet then turned away, maintaining radio silence, leaving the bombers alone as they made their long, hazardous flight toward the Japanese mainland. In Tokyo, the morning began like any other. Planners studied their maps, officers filed reports, Civil servants walked through the streets beneath cherry blossoms just beginning to open. They did not yet know that a line had been crossed, that the safe distance they believed protected their homeland had been breached. The Americans were coming, not with a fleet large enough to threaten Japan's military power, but with a message powerful enough to pierce the illusions of early victory. As the American bombers approached the Japanese coastline, the crews inside each aircraft observed the quiet landscape unfolding beneath them. The Pacific Ocean, which had stretched endlessly behind them, gave way to the rugged outlines of Honshu. Wisps of coastal fog drifted across fishing villages, small harbors, and narrow stretches of farmland. For most of the airmen, this was the first time they had ever seen Japan. They looked out through their cockpits at a land that had once felt impossibly distant, an island nation that, just months earlier, had seemed beyond the reach of American power. Now it lay directly beneath their flight paths, vulnerable in ways no one in Tokyo had anticipated. Doolittle's aircraft led the formation, flying low to avoid early detection. The crews adjusted their altimeters as they passed over ridges and valleys. Farmers below paused momentarily, hearing unfamiliar engines overhead. A few looked up, shading their eyes, confused by the shape of the aircraft. The B-25s were unlike the Japanese planes they had grown accustomed to seeing. They were larger, louder, and approached from a direction that defied expectation. For a fleeting moment, curiosity replaced alarm. Many could not imagine that these foreign aircraft had come with hostile intent. In Tokyo, the city moved through its morning routines with the same confidence that had permeated all levels of Japanese society since the beginning of the war. Government workers walked along the wide avenues leading to the ministries. Streetcars rattled through intersections. Vendors opened their stalls, while students hurried across campus grounds. There was no sense of danger, no warning sirens, no hint that the protective shell of distance and victory was about to fracture. Newspapers that morning carried stories celebrating the empire's recent successes. Editorials discussed the future shape of Asia under Japanese leadership. Nothing in print, or in the thoughts of most readers, suggested that foreign aircraft might soon appear overhead. The first signs of the approaching American bombers came not from military observers, but from the citizens who happened to be beneath their flight path. People in the suburbs surrounding Tokyo noticed the droning of engines. Some pointed toward the sky as the aircraft passed over. Others rushed indoors, unsure whether these unfamiliar planes were friendly or hostile. Moments later, scattered reports reached local police stations. A few officers contacted nearby air defense units, although many assumed these sightings were errors or misidentifications. No prior reconnaissance had warned of an incoming attack, and previous reports of distant ship sightings had been dismissed as improbable. Even as multiple calls came in, the initial response was hesitant. Then the bombers descended over the heart of the city. Doolittle's plane flew directly toward industrial districts, releasing its bombs before banking sharply to avoid rising smoke. The target selection was modest: armories, factories, and storage facilities. But the physical destruction mattered far less than the fact that it was happening at all. People in the streets stopped abruptly as explosions echoed across the neighborhood blocks. The blasts were not massive, but they shattered windows, toppled display shelves, and sent clouds of dust into the air. Confusion replaced routine. For the first time since the war began, Tokyo felt the impact of conflict not as distant news, but as a reality echoing through its avenues. Air raid sirens wailed belatedly, their mechanical wails sweeping across rooftops. Civilians ran for cover, some ducking into underground shelters, others crouching beneath reinforced buildings. Military personnel scrambled to determine the source of the attack. Telephone lines buzzed with hurried messages. A few anti-aircraft guns opened fire, sending shells arching into the sky. But the B-25s flew too quickly and too unexpectedly for any organized interception. Japanese fighters, though numerous, were not positioned to respond in time. The air defense network, built on the belief that an attack from such a distance was impossible, reacted slowly and ineffectively. In ministries across the city, shock rippled through the corridors. Officers who had spent months reviewing reports of American weakness now found themselves confronted with a reality that none of their calculations had prepared for. Someone had misjudged the enemy, badly. The assumption that the Japanese homeland was safe because of distance alone had collapsed in a single morning. The planners hurried to gather information, but what they learned only deepened the unease. The bombers had originated from somewhere far out at sea, likely from a carrier force that had approached undetected. As the American planes continued across the mainland toward the open waters of the East China Sea, Tokyo's military leaders struggled to reconcile what had just occurred. The attack was small. The damage, while noticeable, was limited. But the psychological effect was enormous. In a single operation, the Americans had revealed that Japan's assumptions about its own invulnerability were deeply flawed. The belief that distance protected the homeland had been a cornerstone of Japan's early war strategy. Now it had been disproved, quietly, decisively, and without warning. For the civilians emerging from shelters, the raid ignited a mixture of fear and disbelief. For the military, it marked the beginning of a profound strategic reckoning. And for Yamamoto, who understood the implications more clearly than most, it confirmed a fear he had carried for months. Japan had awakened an enemy capable of reaching farther, striking harder, and mobilizing faster than any planner in Tokyo had been willing to admit. In the hours after the American bombers departed, drifting westward toward the uncertain refuge of China, Tokyo's military command found itself in a state of disarray that had no precedent in the war thus far. Telephones rang continuously inside the Imperial Navy Ministry. Officers rushed between intelligence rooms, attempting to assemble a coherent account of what had occurred. But the information arrived in uneven fragments: civilian sightings, scattered reports from anti-aircraft batteries, and incomplete messages from regional commands. For a city that believed itself untouchable, even a small attack produced an emotional shock far greater than the physical damage. Inside one of the central planning chambers, senior officers gathered around a long table, the same table where only days earlier they had discussed the next phase of Japan's southern expansion. Now, instead of calm deliberation, the room was filled with the uneasy tension of men reassessing assumptions they had treated as unquestionable. A staff officer read a summary confirming that the enemy aircraft were likely medium bombers, not seaplanes, not long-range reconnaissance craft, but full-sized land bombers never believed capable of launching from the sea. The realization settled heavily over the room. These aircraft had come from an American carrier, one that had approached undetected across the vast northern Pacific. The implications were unsettling. Japan's entire defensive strategy for its home islands rested on the belief that its geographic distance from enemy bases created a natural barrier. Reconnaissance patrols, anti-ship picket lines, and coastal observation posts were all built around the assumption that no hostile carrier group would dare venture so close without being detected. And yet, the Americans had done exactly that. The question now facing Tokyo's planners was not simply how the raid had occurred, but what it revealed about the enemy's intentions and capabilities. Yamamoto's closest aides understood immediately how dangerous this moment could become. If the attack was interpreted as a sign that the Americans had rebuilt their Pacific forces quickly, or that they were preparing for sustained offensive action, it might force Japan to rethink its southern operations. But if interpreted as a symbolic gesture, a desperate attempt to restore American morale, Japan might continue its existing plans without significant adjustment. The uncertainty created a dilemma unlike any the staff had faced since the war began. Within the intelligence division, officers reviewed recent intercepts. A pattern emerged that had previously gone unnoticed. Short, encrypted communications that hinted at fleet coordination, followed by unusual silence. In retrospect, these messages aligned with the movement of the American task force, but hindsight offered clarity that had been lacking in the moment. Analysts could only acknowledge that the Americans had shifted their tactics. They were no longer operating in predictable formations, nor were they adhering to patterns observed before Pearl Harbor. They were adapting quickly, perhaps faster than Japanese planners had believed possible. Meanwhile, in the Army Ministry, senior officers received news with a different mixture of concern and disbelief. For them, the strike represented not only a tactical surprise, but a psychological affront. They had reassured the public repeatedly that Japan's military strength guaranteed absolute security for the homeland. The raid shattered that promise, however briefly. Some officers feared that the attack might spark panic among civilians, while others worried that it would embolden American resistance across the Pacific. Above all, they wondered what it revealed about the will of the American people, a factor often dismissed as weak or inconsistent. Across the ministries, meetings were held to discuss how the raid should be presented to the public. The official narrative needed to downplay the scale of the attack while reinforcing Japan's commitment to victory. Government newspapers were instructed to describe the raid as an isolated incident, conducted by a small number of enemy aircraft that caused minimal damage. But even within these carefully crafted statements, the truth could not be entirely obscured. The Americans had reached Tokyo, and if they could reach Tokyo once, they could try again. In private, more reflective voices acknowledged what the event truly signified. The Americans were not waiting years to rebuild. They were not immobilized by fear or indecision. Instead, they were testing Japanese defenses, probing for weaknesses, and demonstrating their capacity to strike at Japan's most sacred center. This was not the behavior of a weakened nation, but of one preparing for a long, determined struggle. As the day progressed, news of the raid spread across the population. Crowds gathered in open squares, some speaking anxiously about the explosions they had heard. Others whispered that the government had underestimated the enemy. A sense of vulnerability emerged, not widespread panic, but a subtle awareness that Japan was not as shielded as many had believed. For a people accustomed to hearing reports of distant victories, the sudden arrival of foreign aircraft over their capital forced a difficult reconsideration of the war's nature. By evening, as lights across Tokyo dimmed under renewed air raid precautions, the mood inside the ministries remained sober. The raid had not halted Japan's expansion, nor had it inflicted significant military loss, but it had pierced the illusion of invincibility that had guided Japanese strategy since Pearl Harbor. And for Yamamoto, who understood the American industrial and psychological strength better than anyone else in Japan, the event confirmed a truth he had warned about long before the war began. Japan had awakened an enemy capable of reaching across oceans, rebuilding at astonishing speed, and striking back with a determination rooted not in desperation, but in resolve. As night settled over Tokyo on the day of the raid, the city's usual glow seemed strangely subdued. Government buildings quietly extinguished lights, civilians moved more cautiously along the streets, and military guards at key intersections felt a tension they had not known since the early days of the war. Though the physical damage from the attack had been limited, the symbolic wound was unmistakable. People spoke in soft, uncertain tones, recalling the thunder of explosions or the brief glimpse of foreign aircraft passing overhead. For most, it was the first evidence that the war they had followed through newspapers and radio broadcasts could indeed reach them, even here, at the center of the empire. Inside the Imperial Navy Ministry, the atmosphere remained heavy with the weight of realization. Senior officers, some still in their uniforms from earlier meetings, sat in smoke-filled rooms discussing the implications of the day's events. Charts lay spread across tables. Intelligence summaries were stacked in uneven piles beside cups of untouched tea. The shock of the raid had slowly given way to a deeper, more introspective mood, one defined not by panic, but by the dawning awareness that Japan had underestimated the scope of the conflict it had begun in December. Central to every conversation was the unanswered question: how had the American carriers approached so closely without detection? The defensive systems Japan had established across the northern Pacific, picket boats, patrol planes, radio listening posts, had been created with the belief that distance itself provided a form of protection. Yet that belief had faltered. The picket boat that encountered the American task force had been destroyed too quickly to transmit a complete warning. Reconnaissance patrols had been scattered by poor weather, and no one in Tokyo had expected the Americans to attempt something so daring, so difficult, and so logistically improbable. In effect, Japan had been surprised not because its defenses were weak, but because its imagination had been. In the hours that followed, officers reviewed the paths of the American bombers, tracing their routes across Honshu and into the East China Sea. The ease with which the aircraft had crossed the Japanese mainland revealed vulnerabilities that had previously seemed irrelevant. Anti-aircraft batteries were unevenly distributed, with many designed primarily to protect naval bases rather than urban centers. Fighter squadrons, though experienced, were not positioned for rapid interception, and the communication networks between regional commands lacked the speed and coordination needed to respond to a sudden and unexpected threat. These weaknesses had mattered little during Japan's months of uninterrupted victories, but now, suddenly exposed, they demanded attention. Yamamoto, aboard his flagship far from Tokyo, received reports of the raid throughout the day. Those who witnessed his reaction described him as calm, contemplative, and unsurprised. He had long feared exactly this outcome, not the destruction caused by the bombs, but the awakening of American determination. He understood, perhaps better than any other officer in the Japanese military, that the United States had the industrial capacity to absorb losses, rebuild quickly, and strike with increasing strength. The raid served as an early sign of that coming transformation. In private conversations with his staff, Yamamoto reminded them that the American people would not be intimidated by distance or by the scale of the Pacific. Once committed, they would fight with the full weight of their industrial and political power. Within Tokyo, these ideas were only beginning to take hold. The Army Ministry, which had focused much of its strategic planning on continental operations in China and Southeast Asia, now faced the uncomfortable possibility that the United States might pose a more immediate and unpredictable threat. Some officers argued that Japan needed to strengthen its coastal defenses, improve its radar systems, and expand its fighter coverage. Others insisted that the Americans had simply acted out of desperation and would be unable to repeat such a mission. But beneath these disagreements lay the unspoken recognition that the assumptions guiding Japan's early war strategy were no longer reliable. As the night deepened, discussion shifted to the broader consequences of the raid. The attack had been too small to cripple any major military installations, yet its political impact was profound. It disrupted the narrative of Japanese invincibility that had been carefully cultivated since the outbreak of the war. It forced the public to confront the reality that the United States was not a distant, weakened opponent, but a nation capable of reaching across the ocean to strike at the heart of the empire. And it raised troubling questions about the future trajectory of the conflict, questions that neither the Army nor the Navy could answer with confidence. By midnight, as officers finally dispersed from their meetings, a sense of unease settled fully across the ministries. Plans would have to be reconsidered, defensive measures revised, intelligence systems improved. Yet even as these thoughts took shape, the larger strategic dilemma remained unresolved. Japan had built its early successes on the premise that the United States would take years to recover from Pearl Harbor. The Doolittle raid had shown that this premise was dangerously flawed. The Americans were rebuilding faster than expected, thinking more creatively than anticipated, and preparing themselves for a conflict that might last far longer than the swift campaign Japan had imagined. The bombers had long vanished into the clouds over the East China Sea, most of them destined for uncertain landings in China. But the echo of their engines lingered in Tokyo far longer than the sound itself. The raid had achieved what no amount of material damage could accomplish. It had shaken the foundation of Japan's strategic confidence. From this moment forward, every Japanese decision, military, political, and diplomatic, would be made with the knowledge that the enemy was neither defeated nor afraid, but awakening. In the days that followed the raid, the immediate shock in Tokyo began to give way to a more measured but no less troubling period of reassessment. Meetings convened across the capital as senior officers attempted to determine how the Americans had managed to strike the home islands with such unexpected precision. Reports circulated from naval stations along the eastern seaboard, each recounting fragments of the event. Fleeting glimpses of unfamiliar aircraft, hurried transmissions from coastal defenses, and scrambled fighter units that had arrived too late to intercept the intruders. The narrative of early war triumph, which had guided Japan's sense of strategic identity for months, now felt unsettled. Confidence remained, but it was no longer unbroken. At the Imperial General Headquarters, the task of interpreting the raid fell jointly to the Army and Navy, though their perspectives differed sharply. The Army, focused primarily on campaigns in China and Burma, viewed the attack as an isolated incident, an act of American bravado rather than a sign of sustained offensive capability. They reasoned that the United States, still stretched thin across the Pacific, could not afford to squander aircraft on symbolic missions. The Navy, however, could not dismiss the implications so easily. For them, the fact that American carriers had slipped through Japan's defensive perimeter undetected represented not just boldness, but a changing pattern in U.S. naval behavior. If the Americans had learned to mask their approach once, they could do so again. As officers examined the path of the raid, one factor became increasingly clear. Japanese intelligence had failed not through lack of skill, but through a rigid framework of expectation. Analysts had spent the early months of the war studying enemy behavior as it had existed before Pearl Harbor. They had cataloged typical American flight patterns, radio procedures, and reconnaissance habits. But the Americans were no longer following those patterns. Their fleet movements had grown unpredictable. Their reconnaissance had become more varied. Their communications, once easy to categorize, now shifted in timing and structure. The raid exposed this shift in stark relief. Meanwhile, public reaction across Japan reflected a complex mix of emotions. Many citizens, already accustomed to hearing of victories in distant territories, found it difficult to reconcile those triumphs with the sudden appearance of foreign aircraft over Tokyo. Newspapers downplayed the damage, emphasizing Japanese resilience and describing the attackers as small enemy forces attempting a futile display. But even state-controlled media could not fully erase the significance of the moment. The fact that the Americans had reached Japan, physically, undeniably, introduced a sliver of doubt into a populace that had previously believed the islands were beyond the reach of war. This doubt grew quietly in private conversations. Families discussed the sound of the explosions, the sight of smoke rising in the distance, or the strange aircraft passing overhead. Shopkeepers spoke of customers who had rushed into stores seeking shelter. Teachers reported that children questioned why the homeland, supposedly protected by the Imperial Navy, had been attacked at all. Even though the government discouraged speculation, the event lingered in the public mind. It was a reminder that modern warfare could cross oceans, and that no nation, no matter how powerful, was completely shielded. Back in the Navy Ministry, Yamamoto's staff worked meticulously through intercepted messages and intelligence summaries. Although Yamamoto himself remained calm, many of his subordinates sensed a shift in his demeanor, a quiet confirmation of ideas he had long expressed. He had warned the general staff that early victories would encourage dangerous assumptions. He had insisted that the United States possessed a capacity for industrial mobilization unmatched anywhere in the world. And he had cautioned that once the Americans committed themselves fully, Japan would face a relentless and increasingly coordinated enemy. The Doolittle raid did not prove these predictions outright, but it illuminated the path toward them. The American bombers, after dropping their ordnance, had continued westward toward China. Some crash-landed in remote fields. Others were forced down by dwindling fuel. Local villagers in parts of Zhejiang and Jiangxi encountered the crews, injured, exhausted, yet alive. Many were helped by Chinese civilians and resistance groups, actions that would later provoke brutal Japanese reprisals across the region. Tokyo's frustration grew as reports filtered in of American airmen escaping toward inland China. Their survival underscored another uncomfortable truth. The United States had succeeded not only in striking Japan, but in doing so without catastrophic loss to their own forces. This fact unsettled naval planners who had long believed the Americans were too cautious to undertake operations with unpredictable outcomes. The raid's success suggested a new American willingness to accept risk, an attribute that Japanese strategists had not previously assigned to their adversaries. If this mindset spread through the U.S. command, it could reshape the entire course of the Pacific War. By the end of the week, one conclusion had emerged with clarity inside the Navy Ministry. Japan could no longer assume that distance alone would protect its homeland. The Americans had demonstrated both ingenuity and resilience. They had revealed gaps in Japanese defenses, and although the raid itself did not inflict decisive military harm, it signaled that the United States was awakening, slowly at first, but with a growing determination that would reshape the Pacific conflict. The echo of the Doolittle raid still reverberated in quiet conversations across Tokyo. And though outward confidence persisted, the illusion of absolute safety had begun to fade. For the first time since December, Japan's planners saw the faint outline of a future in which the war they believed they controlled might soon be dictated by someone else. As the first week after the raid drew to a close, the broader consequences of the attack began to crystallize across all levels of Japan's military and political leadership. What had initially appeared as a small, symbolic gesture by the Americans now revealed itself as a moment with far-reaching implications. The raid had not destroyed armories or crippled naval bases, but it had exposed the fragility of assumptions on which Japanese strategy had been built. And as senior officers met in increasingly frequent sessions, a subtle but unmistakable shift could be felt. One marked not by overt panic, but by the steady erosion of certainty. In the Imperial General Headquarters, analysts revisited the intercepted radio transmissions and intelligence fragments that had preceded the attack. They realized belatedly that the unusual patterns in American communications, once dismissed as noise, reflected coordinated fleet maneuvers. Some signals corresponded to the timing of the U.S. task force's advance. Others suggested reconnaissance sweeps far from expected zones. Yet none had been interpreted correctly at the time. The failure did not lie in the skill of the intelligence officers, but in the mental framework that guided their interpretation. They had scanned the Pacific through the lens of early war victories, relying on the assumption that the Americans would act predictably, cautiously, and within the boundaries of their damaged capabilities. That framework had now collapsed. Officers spoke openly of their need to revise operational doctrines, especially those concerning threat assessment and early warning systems. The picket boat network, stretched thin across thousands of miles of ocean, was deemed inadequate. Reconnaissance flights were inconsistent, limited by both weather and outdated expectations of enemy behavior. Even the placement of radar stations, still in their early stages of development, was influenced by assumptions that no hostile carrier group would approach from the direction the Americans had chosen. The Doolittle raid revealed not so much the weakness of Japanese defenses as the danger of defending against what one expects rather than what is possible. Meanwhile, Yamamoto, commanding the combined fleet from afar, reviewed the reports with the same calm precision that characterized his approach to all strategic matters. His previous warnings, once considered overly cautious, now carried new weight. For years, he had argued that Japan's early victories could not sustain a long war. His experiences in America had given him insight into its industrial capacity, an insight many of his peers lacked or dismissed. The raid confirmed for him what he had feared since December, that the United States possessed the will and creativity to strike far earlier and far more boldly than Japanese strategists believed. Within the Navy ministry, the question of how to respond became central to every discussion. Some officers argued for strengthening the defensive perimeter around Japan, expanding patrol lines, increasing air cover, and reinforcing distant outposts. Others insisted that the best defense was a decisive offense. Japan must crush the American carrier force before it could evolve into a greater threat. In their view, the raid was the first warning sign of a growing American capacity, not an isolated act. If Japan waited, they feared, the United States would regain momentum and eventually dominate the Pacific. These debates created a quiet rift between the most cautious strategists, those who urged consolidation, and the more aggressive commanders, who viewed hesitation as dangerous. The raid provided ammunition for both perspectives. Those advocating caution pointed to the vulnerability revealed in Japan's defenses. Those pushing for offensive action argued that the Americans had demonstrated both daring and adaptability, qualities that must be countered before they intensified. In the civilian sphere, the government faced its own challenges. Officials issued carefully worded statements emphasizing the raid's limited material impact while assuring the public of continued national strength. But these messages could not fully erase the anxiety now simmering beneath the surface. In markets, cafes, and crowded train stations, people spoke quietly about the attack. Some wondered whether more raids would follow. Others questioned how the Americans had reached Japan at all. While the state-controlled newspapers framed the event as insignificant, the public understood that a psychological boundary had been crossed. This shift in public sentiment, though understated, was not lost on Japan's leaders. They recognized that maintaining morale required more than reassurance. It required action. The nation needed to believe that the military could not only repel future attacks, but prevent them entirely. And so, discussions began on how best to restore a sense of invulnerability, if not in reality, then at least in the perceptions of both soldiers and civilians. As the days passed, the implications of the raid continued to ripple outward. Japanese commanders in the field reported increased American air activity in the South Pacific. Submarines operating near the Hawaiian Islands encountered more coordinated Allied patrols. Signals intelligence detected sharper discipline in American communications. These developments reinforced the idea that the United States was adjusting its tactics, learning from early defeats, and preparing for a sustained conflict rather than a brief contest of momentum. By the end of the week, a quiet understanding took hold across Japan's highest command. The raid had not been a desperate gesture by a wounded enemy. It had been a declaration, a message, delivered on the wings of 16 bombers, that the United States intended to fight with resolve and imagination. It revealed that the war would not follow the easy trajectory Japanese planners had predicted. Instead, it would become a prolonged and unpredictable struggle, shaped not by initial victories, but by the endurance and adaptability of both nations. The Americans, once underestimated, were awakening, and the faint echo of their arrival over Tokyo served as a reminder that the Pacific, immense as it was, offered no guarantee of safety, not anymore. In the weeks following the raid, the shifting mood inside Japan's military leadership became increasingly apparent, even to those who had previously dismissed the Americans as a distant, crippled power. What had begun as a moment of shock gradually evolved into a broader reconsideration of Japan's strategic trajectory. The nation still possessed vast territorial gains. Its armies remained deep in China, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies. Its navy continued to dominate the Western Pacific. Yet beneath these achievements, senior officers could sense something intangible but undeniable, a subtle change in the balance of intent. The United States, once believed incapable of rapid retaliation, had demonstrated not only its reach, but its willingness to take risks that defied Japanese expectations. Inside the Imperial Navy Ministry, planning sessions shifted in tone. The confidence that had filled the rooms in December and January now gave way to more measured discussions. Charts depicting Japanese advances still hung across the walls, but now they were accompanied by new maps showing potential American carrier routes, possible staging points, and vulnerabilities in Japan's defensive perimeter. The raid forced planners to acknowledge that their previous assumptions that had guided nearly every major decision since Pearl Harbor, were no longer reliable. One of the most pressing concerns centered on Japan's vast, scattered empire. The territories acquired during the first months of the war required extensive resources to defend. Airfields, supply stations, and naval bases spanned thousands of miles. Japan had stretched its reach across the Pacific like a long, fragile thread, impressive in appearance, but vulnerable if struck at key points. Some officers argued that Japan needed to consolidate these holdings and strengthen its defensive lines. Others insisted that retreat, even a partial one, was unthinkable. To them, the solution was to strike even harder, to eliminate the American carrier force before it could develop into a larger threat. The Doolittle raid had done more than break the illusion of invulnerability. It had intensified the divide between these competing visions of the war's future. As this debate unfolded, Yamamoto's influence grew increasingly significant. While he remained a respected figure within the Navy, his views on American strength and the limits of Japanese endurance were now taken far more seriously than before. His prediction that Japan had, at best, 18 months to capitalize on its early victories before American industrial power became overwhelming began circulating quietly among officers. Yamamoto understood that the Americans were not merely rebuilding, they were organizing themselves for a war of attrition, a contest Japan was ill-equipped to win. And the raid, though modest in its physical impact, confirmed that the Americans would not be content to wait patiently for a future advantage. They were already searching for ways to strike, disrupt, and destabilize Japanese strategy. As April turned into May, reports from across the Pacific reinforced this growing concern. Japanese commanders in the South Pacific noticed increased Allied reconnaissance. Coast watchers reported unusual naval activity near the Solomon Islands. Submarines encountered American patrols more frequently than before. Each piece of information, considered alone, appeared minor, yet taken together, they suggested that the United States was preparing for operations far larger than any Japan had anticipated at this stage of the war. Meanwhile, within civilian society, the memory of the raid lingered. Tokyo residents walked past patched roofs, shattered windows, and repaired facades, small reminders that an enemy once thought distant had reached the capital itself. Government statements continued to emphasize Japan's military strength, but civilians had begun to understand that the war was entering a new phase. The emotional distance that had once separated them from the front lines had narrowed. Even those who remained confident in Japan's ultimate victory sensed that the conflict ahead would be neither brief nor easy. For the High Command, the most pressing question became how to regain strategic initiative. The raid had demonstrated that Japan could no longer rely on passive defenses or the comfort of geographical isolation. The Americans were adapting quickly, and Japan needed to respond with decisive action. This mindset fueled the momentum behind Yamamoto's forthcoming plans, especially the ambitious operation aimed at drawing the American carriers into a decisive battle near Midway. To many officers, this appeared to be the logical next step. Destroy the U.S. naval air power in one decisive blow, secure Japan's perimeter, and force the Americans into a defensive posture. But underlying this plan was the lingering shadow of the raid, a reminder that the Americans often acted in ways that defied Japanese predictions. Their willingness to attempt the improbable made them an adversary fundamentally different from the British, Dutch, or even the Russians. The psychological terrain of the war had shifted. Japan could still claim operational superiority, but its strategic certainty had been pierced, leaving a vulnerability that charts and briefings could not conceal. By the end of the month, as new orders were issued and fleets prepared to move, the memory of the Doolittle raiders continued to echo quietly through Tokyo's corridors. It was not the damage that haunted Japan's planners, it was the meaning. The raid had shown that the Pacific was not as vast a shield as they had believed, and that their enemy was far more determined than early war victories had suggested. What the Americans failed to destroy with bombs, they shattered with message. Japan's war would not be short. It would not be simple, and it would not be one-sided. The illusion of early triumph had ended. The long struggle was only beginning.